I'm Nala Ayad. Welcome to Ideas, and to the fourth of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, by world-renowned Internet communications and security expert Ron Deibert. We've got a problem. The Internet, the great tool that was supposed to put information at everyone's fingertips and make the world a whole lot better, has been taken over by forces that seem beyond our control. In his 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Ron Deibert explores what went wrong and what we might do about it. Ron Deibert is director of Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, a research group that focuses on digital threats to human rights and civil society. They've investigated cyber attacks against Mexican journalists, disinformation spread by Iran, and the hacking of the Democratic Party emails in 2016. In his 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Ron Deibert ranges over many of the issues that plague the Internet and social media. The latest insights into the psychology of marketing and the hacking of human behavior are being used to turn us into addicts. Our personal data is being vacuumed up, turning us all into products for sale. Governments in general and malign players in particular are using social media tools against us as a weapon. And the question is, what is to be done? There's no Massey Lectures tour this year, but we've assembled a panel to comment on what Ron Deibert is talking about. Some of the people you'll hear from time to time through the programs are writer and filmmaker Astra Taylor, human rights lawyer Chinmayi Arun, philosophy professor Tamsin Shah, journalist and author Misha Glenny, former Google executive Meredith Whittaker, journalist and author John Naughton, and political scientist Daniel Dewdney. On Ideas, here's Ron Deibert with the fourth of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures.
This is Lecture 4, A Great Leap Forward for the Abuse of Power. Part 1, The Saudis. Tuesday, October 2nd, 2018, 10:09 p.m., Den Haag, Netherlands, 12:09 a.m., Istanbul, Turkey. A WhatsApp message appears. I'm not freaking out, but Mr. Jamal Khashoggi was kidnapped this morning, so I'm not pretty sure about what is going on. I looked down at Omar's text as I checked into my hotel room for a cybersecurity conference in Den Haag, Netherlands. At that precise moment, nearly 3,000 kilometers away in Istanbul, Turkey, a macabre, premeditated act of murder was being covered up by the butchers responsible. Earlier that day, exiled Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi entered the Saudi Arabia consulate in Istanbul, hoping to pick up papers related to his upcoming marriage. His fiancée waited outside, dutifully holding his phones for safekeeping. Later, as the hours ticked by without his return, she paced back and forth apprehensively, checking the phones repeatedly, but to no avail. She would never see her beloved again. As Khashoggi walked through the front doors of the consulate, captured in CCTV footage subsequently seen worldwide, little did he realize that waiting and hiding for him were 15 Saudi intelligence agents. A kill squad, as if straight out of Mission Impossible, had been specifically assembled and flown into Turkey from Saudi Arabia on separate private jets for a carefully planned execution. Electronic interceptions made by Turkish intelligence and shared with special UN investigators revealed what happened next. A large group of men surrounded and apprehended him roughly. "I can't breathe," Khashoggi gasped repeatedly before eventually succumbing altogether. At that time, like just about everyone else in the world, I had no clue about the gruesome murder. My pressing concern was with the urgent text message glowing up at me from my phone as I looked out my hotel room window into the night. Jamal Khashoggi is missing? I asked myself. What does this have to do with Omar? Why is he so frightened? Omar Abdulaziz is a Canadian university student and a prominent Saudi activist who sought and received asylum in Canada in 2014 after Saudi Arabia revoked his scholarship for his outspoken criticism of the regime. Prior to the Khashoggi execution, Omar was most well known for the popular satirical talk show he hosts on YouTube, and for his Twitter account followed by 500,000. Thereafter, he has been forever linked to Khashoggi's murder. Like many other authoritarian regimes, Saudi Arabia has aggressively pursued extensive social media manipulation, digital subversion, and cyber espionage. While some of it has been directed at regional rivals like Iran and Qatar, the bulk of it is intended to thwart political opposition and dissent, both at home and abroad. For despots like the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS as he's widely known, the principal national security threat is anything that undermines his own regime. Political opposition, out of bounds. Criticism of MBS himself, treason. Assertion of women's rights, not unless we men permit it, and don't even dare to try to mobilize women around it. Strictly taboo. As is the case with despots the world over, MBS has had to contend with digital-enabled opposition, including criticism of his rule swirling unimpeded around Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Although the domestic sources of such criticism are easier to squelch, for the obvious reasons of proximity and the omnipresent threat of arbitrary arrest or torture, the Saudi diaspora presents a much more complex challenge. Digital influencers like Omar, who are sheltered in foreign jurisdictions like Canada, are the greatest risk, relentlessly trumpeting their disrespect for all to see and hear. But social media and the digital devices that connect to them are double-edged swords. Fortunately, for MBS that is, the dissidents' reliance on social media and their related accessories also happens to be their Achilles heel. Highly invasive by design, often unintentionally revealing of their most intimate details, persistently plagued by insecurities, and therefore easy to exploit. One of the key figures overseeing Saudi Arabia's offensive counter-dissent cyber operations was Saad al-Qahtani, reportedly a close friend of MBS and an individual who rose through the ranks based on his experience and enthusiasm for the tools of digital repression. Al-Qahtani circulated through various minor state media posts early in his career, but as MBS's authority grew and he was looking for digital expertise, Al-Qahtani became his go-to guy, and thus Saudi Arabia's digital enforcer. In Omar's case, Al-Qahtani's operatives were able to use Pegasus spyware to silently commandeer Omar's device and acquire an unprecedented, intimate window into his private life. Thanks to Pegasus, they could observe his every movement. They could see his Twitter posts, emails, and SMS messages, even while they were being composed. They could turn on the camera and microphone to record his meetings, or gather incriminating pictures of Omar's private affairs that in turn could be used for blackmail. But most insidiously, they could silently observe, as if looking over his shoulder, while Omar and his friend Khashoggi hatched plans to mobilize opposition to MBS and the Saudi regime. For weeks, Saudi operatives vacuumed up and analyzed everything that Omar communicated, including his regular interactions with Khashoggi. They eavesdropped as Omar and Khashoggi heaped disdain on the Saudi regime and on MBS personally. "The more victims he eats, the more he wants," Khashoggi sent in a WhatsApp message, referring to MBS, whom he also described as a beast. They monitored Omar's and Khashoggi's plans to counter the Lord of the Flies with what they called an army of bees. Khashoggi even offered to finance it, transferring thousands of dollars to Omar to seed the campaign. In the eyes of Saudi despots, such plans amounted to treason punishable by death. And that's just what happened to Khashoggi on that fateful October day in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Autocrats are not averse to combining digital and physical surveillance. At one point in the summer of 2018, Saudi officials visited Omar in person in Canada to try to persuade him to give up his activism and return to Saudi Arabia. Presciently, Omar secretly recorded those conversations and later turned them over to the press. They brought Omar's brother along, dangling him as a putative threat. Drop your social media nonsense, return home, and everyone will be fine. They even tried to encourage him to come to the Saudi embassy in Ottawa, a terrifying prospect in light of what would later befall his friend Khashoggi. Don't do it, advised Khashoggi to the younger Omar. I wouldn't trust them. Omar took this advice to heart. Khashoggi himself apparently did not. On October 2nd, 2018, Jamal Khashoggi would enter the Saudi consulate in Turkey and would never be seen again.
It's John Norton here. I thought that Ron's account of what happened to Khashoggi was one of the most scary and chilling stories we currently have about the technology and the way it can be used. But I think one of the things we have now learned is that autocrats actually are better at using this allegedly democratizing technology than democratic regimes. I think that's the great lesson of the Arab Spring. They cottoned on pretty quickly, and they're now using the same technology against political agitation, against demonstrations, against whistleblowers, and against dissidents. And they can do it with a kind of precision at a distance that's truly frightening. And in that sense, the technology has turned on us. We thought that it was always going to be liberating and democratizing. And sometimes it's actually enslaving.
So this is Astra. This is a very interesting question, which is what would social media look like in a more equal world? Would it then inevitably trend towards autocracy? I mean, we don't know. Social media is developing in this context where there are people with power who want to exploit it. Right now, the problem, I think, is that, a lot of big corporations, private contractors are, willing to do deals with autocrats. I mean, that's part of what we're seeing here is, American companies are really happy to do business with the Saudis if there's money to be made and human rights be damned. But I think there is potential on the fringes for people to still take back some of these tools and do something different. To me, I feel like this technology has potential to be reclaimed, redesigned, and put to different purposes. And if we just cede the technology to this destructive business model and these nefarious political purposes, we're already admitting that we're going to lose. And so the technology itself has potential if it's in the hands of different engineers, different constituencies, and is made to serve different economic principles. So I don't want to lose sight of that. Technology assisting autocrats, and the politically powerful. I mean, right now they have more power. So they're better able to deploy these tools, right? They're better able to access the engineering talent. They're better able to pay for the servers. They're better able to build the data centers. And so in that sense, in all sorts of parts of our lives, the decks are stacked in their favor.
Part 2, Spyware. The 2011 Arab Spring. It was only 9 years ago, but in internet years, that's a lifetime. How long ago and in another world does it now seem that we all watched in shock as long-standing dictators succumb to the people power of the social media age? It's a Twitter rebellion, a Facebook revolution. Geographic distance? No matter. We are wired together in a movement too strong to resist. Power hierarchies are a thing of the past. Or so it seemed for that brief, sparkling moment. While most of the Western media and policy world was drawing such sweeping people power conclusions, the autocrats themselves, watching it all unfold, were asking a much different question. How do we prevent something like that from ever happening again? It was not long before they and their security agencies began to realize just how useful it is to have their adversaries plugged in, networked, and online communicating. How convenient it is to see who their friends and family members are. How easy it is to track their movements, to see their planning in progress as it unfolds from the very device they hold in their hands and that they carry with them as they go about their daily business. How different it is from the time when moving to another country would shield them from the dictator's totalizing gaze and iron grip. Thanks to social media and spyware, we're in your chats. We're in your Skype calls. We're in your bedroom. We're in your mind. Whetting the appetites of autocrats while simultaneously educating them on means and methods have been the private intelligence and surveillance contractors, most of them based or originating in the West. While states do develop surveillance systems in-house, the reality is that most surveillance services are outsourced to private industry. Although commercial, these are not the type of services anyone can just order up through Amazon. These tools are marketed benignly as a way to assist law enforcement, anti-terror, and other national security investigations. What we have found is that they are widely abused instead, in the hands of despots and autocrats who define crime and terrorism as including virtually anything that challenges their right to rule. Spyware has been used to hack into the devices of journalists, activists, human rights defenders, humanitarians, exiled political opposition figures, lawyers, and academics. This wild west of abusive targeting is not surprising considering controls on the market are virtually non-existent. Perhaps the most notorious of the spyware companies we at Citizen Lab have been tracking is widely considered among the most sophisticated, Israel-based NSO Group, also known as Q Technologies, a company closely aligned with the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Far from taming abuses connected to the spyware market, Israel's Ministry of Defense routinely grants export licenses for NSO's sales, as well as those of other Israel-based surveillance companies. NSO Group first came onto our radar in August 2016, when award-winning United Arab Emirates-based human rights activist Ahmad Mansour received 2 text messages on his iPhone purporting to show evidence of torture in UAE prisons. As a human rights defender, Ahmad might have been tempted to click on those links. Instead, he forwarded them to Citizen Lab for analysis. Clicking on those links in a laboratory setting allowed us to infect an iPhone we controlled and inspect a copy of NSO Group's custom Pegasus spyware. The spyware was extraordinarily sophisticated and included exploits that took advantage of 3 separate flaws in Apple's operating system that even Apple itself was unaware of at the time. Throughout 2017 and 2018, we partnered with Mexican human rights investigators at organizations like Social Tick and R3D to follow up on technical leads from our network scanning to identify abusive targeting in Mexico. Eventually, we unearthed research scientists, health advocates, journalists, lawyers, and even international investigators into mass disappearances whose phones had received text messages embedded with NSO-laden links. We found that the Mexican government operators of the spyware would even attempt to infect the devices of targets' friends and family members. 2 days after Mexican investigative journalist Javier Valdez Cardenas was gunned down in the streets of Mexico in a cartel-linked murder, we confirmed that his wife and colleagues received SMS messages tainted with NSO spyware links, purporting to show evidence of who was responsible for the killings. Similarly, we discovered that the devices of a group of international investigators looking into a grotesque 2014 mass disappearance of 43 Mexican students were all targeted with NSO spyware. The power of this type of technology explains why this marketplace for spyware is so lucrative. In the past, for Saudi Arabia to spy on someone like Omar Abdulaziz, they would have had to travel to Canada. To listen in on his phone calls, they would have had to somehow wiretap his landline, something almost certainly out of their reach, both technically and legally, as long as he lived abroad. At best, they might be able to put some hidden microphones and cameras in his apartment, but even that would only work if he was discussing something sensitive while sitting in the room that happened to be bugged. And all of it at significant personal risk for the agents, who would have to undertake a break-and-enter operation in a foreign country. It's as if, armed with this type of spyware, Saudi agents are practically inside a target's head. They don't even have to set foot in a foreign country, let alone undertake risky physical surveillance operations. From the comfort of an air-conditioned bunker in Riyadh, Saudi agents can take turns listening in, or scoop up a massive load of data and then store it all for later analysis. Social media and our entire communications ecosystem as a whole profoundly transform the cost-benefit ratio and the opportunity structures for political elites to undertake surveillance. They radically erase the distance between those who exercise authority and the human objects of their control, both domestically and abroad. The very tools that civil society relies on to organize, educate, and publicize have become its most vulnerable points of insecurity, the very pathways its adversaries exploit to get inside and neutralize it. Omar, like most millennial activists, spends a great deal of his life online. His Twitter account and YouTube videos have generated millions of followers with whom he interacts on those platforms, leaving a trail of data along the way. As an activist, he engages in a multitude of conversations, some that he might reasonably assume are either private or secure, many through his desktop computer, others through his mobile device. Targets like Omar lack capacity and resources to defend themselves. They are entirely dependent on consumer products made by technology companies for whom security is often an afterthought, intentionally designed to extract as much data as possible from their customers and follow them around wherever they go. It may be hard for someone who hasn't been targeted by a despot abroad to appreciate how such attacks foment an insidious and inescapable fear. Fear of being watched and listened to. Fear that you or your loved ones are exposed. Fear that your life could be taken away at any moment. For dictators and despots, that may be the most valuable effect of them all. Writing in the 18th century on the topic of despotism, the political theorist Baron de Montesquieu infamously described fear as the principle of despotic government. According to Montesquieu, fear undermines the exercise of reason and any other morally based civil action. It induces a kind of paralysis, depresses the spirits, and extinguishes even the least sense of ambition. It seeks to isolate individuals from each other and thus neuter civic associations that may hold despots to account. Although Montesquieu would no doubt have his mind blown by the instant global reach of social media, he'd be sadly familiar with the way despotic fear has insinuated itself into the mix, gumming up the machinery of organized civil society, terrorizing people like Omar with the prospect that someone, somewhere, might be looking over their shoulder, or worse yet, peering back at them from the device they hold in their hand. While social media may be new, the type of political repression they facilitate is ancient. For despots across time, says Montesquieu, whatever inspires fear is the fittest spring of government. It is a reminder, often overlooked, that while we may perceive our devices and social media accounts as our windows to the world, the flow of communications over the internet works in both directions. Those devices and accounts are also a window into our lives for those on the outside looking in. Far from being the existential threat that many observers of the Arab Spring assumed, social media have turned out to be a dictator's best friend.
It's Misha Glenny again, and I've been interested in this subject for a very long time. One of the things that fascinates me about it is that, of course, when the internet was emerging in the 1990s, it was for a few years colonized to a large degree by a sort of anarchic, free-spirited, almost hippie-style community, particularly on the West Coast, but also when it was emerging. I was living in Greece, and I was watching the bulletin boards, how ordinary Greeks and Turks were talking to each other over the internet, and in so doing, overcoming a lot of the prejudices existing between the peoples of those two countries. So everyone had this tremendous hope that the internet was going to be this great tool of democratization, and that it would expose the malfeasance and the malintention of state and corporate interests. Now, by this time, it was clear that the internet was going to be the most powerful communications technology in history, and so it was fairly obvious that it was far too important for states and corporations to leave it in the hands of ordinary people. The speed, however, with which intelligence agencies and militaries in particular have appropriated these tools has been extraordinary. And now most countries are using data from their citizens to monitor, to see what they're up to. It really is Big Brother territory.
You're listening to the fourth of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, A Great Leap Forward for the Abuse of Power by Ron Deibert. This is Ideas in Canada on CBC Radio 1, on Sirius XM across North America, in Australia on RN, and around the world at cbc.ca/ideas. I'm Nala Ayed. It's looking as if the internet and social media have been taken over by extremists and bad actors. We've all been turned into addicts. Our personal data is being stolen and sold to the highest bidder. We're spied on and surveilled by foreign powers, and the phones and tablets we're all using are polluting the planet. So how do we get back control? Digital technologies, says Ron Deibert, have given state security agencies an unparalleled ability to peer inside our lives. The booming surveillance industry has equipped bad state actors with a whole palette of tools for social and individual control they could never have imagined. This is a great leap forward for the abuse of power, the fourth of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures. Here's Ron Deibert.
Part 3. Cameras are everywhere. When one considers digital authoritarianism, the first thing that probably comes to mind is China, and for good reason. China has embarked on a massive experiment to exploit big data in the service of Big Brother. A major concern among those who value civil liberties and privacy is to what extent and under what legal conditions the state can access customer data from digital platforms. China offers a peek at what it looks like when most, if not all, prior restraints are removed. China's cybersecurity law requires private companies to police their users, censor communications on their platforms, and hand over user data to authorities on request. China's censorship and surveillance over the internet and social media are broad and sweeping. The backbone is the so-called Great Firewall, which filters access to foreign-hosted websites, undertakes mass surveillance, and is occasionally used to inject malicious code into network traffic or repurpose web requests into distributed denial-of-service attacks. In China, facial recognition systems have been deployed almost completely in the absence of any privacy protections or other legal restraints as part of a dystopian, science fiction-worthy project called Skynet. The cameras are now commonplace all over China, an estimated 1 camera for every 7th person, which turns out to be roughly 200 million of them. Combining the imagery with artificial intelligence systems has helped local authorities root out uncivilized behavior, which apparently includes wearing pajamas in public or jaywalking. Images of such transgressions are then projected onto large billboards to shame people. There is another deeply disturbing side of China's experiment in social control, the way it has been employed as part of a massive genocidal campaign to police, incarcerate, and re-educate its Muslim minority populations. In the western region of Xinjiang, home to the Muslim Uyghur population, Chinese authorities have used vague counter-terrorism laws to justify the mass internment of upwards of 1 million people. Digital technologies are integral elements of the repression and include widely deployed surveillance cameras paired with AI-enabled facial recognition systems trained to spot and track ethnic minorities both within and beyond Xinjiang. Absent deliberate checks and balances, or laws that protect civil liberties, China's experiment in digital authoritarianism can develop largely unhindered, in turn providing a model for other autocrats and despots the world over to emulate. That's a fairly predictable outcome for an easy case like China. What's happening closer to home is another matter of concern. In January 2020, New York Times journalist Kashmir Hill broke the story of an obscure facial recognition AI startup called Clearview AI. Invented by Hon Ton That, a young software developer, among whose previous little-known accomplishments is an app that let people put Donald Trump's distinctive yellow hair on their photos, Clearview's system works by mathematically matching photos of persons of interest to billions of online images the company has scraped from social media. Among Clearview's clients, numerous federal agencies in the United States, including the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection, the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and numerous so-called fusion centers run by DHS and spread across the United States. Hundreds of regional, state, county, and local law enforcement agencies across the United States queried its databases as well. Clearview AI had ambitious plans to expand its customer base globally. As Kashmir Hill reported, its clients included, quote, national law enforcement agencies, government bodies, and police forces in Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Ireland, India, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Serbia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Several of these countries are known to engage in systematic human rights violations. In addition, at least 30 Canadian law enforcement agencies used Clearview's system, including the RCMP and the Toronto Police Service, which ran 3,400 searches across about 150 accounts. A follow-up investigation by the Toronto Star found that 9 law enforcement agencies that had initially denied using the system in fact were customers or employed individuals who were using it. Even Via Rail's private security services used Clearview AI. Although there are many lessons to be drawn, the Clearview AI case shows how police and other security agencies are experiencing a profound great leap forward in the capabilities of remote control, but without any compensating measures to prevent abuse. Today, high-resolution digital surveillance cameras are omnipresent, scattered throughout our cities, sprinkled throughout public transportation systems, mounted on the exteriors of buildings and entrances to residences, worn on the bodies of police officers, peering back at us from our ATM machines, and installed on freeways and city streets. Layered underneath those fixed cameras are the billions of consumer devices that nearly everyone carries with them at all times, the standard features of which include a built-in digital camera. Multiplying the effects is a widespread selfie culture of auto-surveillance, in which digital images of people's faces are frequently snapped and then shared on social media platforms with a mere click. Thanks to parental pride, unwitting children are given a head start as the evolution of their facial features is recorded with digital precision from birth and then uploaded to social media platforms where it is analyzed and archived. From practically the moment a baby is delivered and onwards through that child's young life, recording, tagging, and uploading their digital images to social media is now considered routine. As the images are digitized, they can be easily converted into a matrix of data points that algorithms and artificial intelligence systems can sift through and sort. A person's unique biometric features become the equivalent of a digital fingerprint. Systems measure features on a person's face based on dozens of nodal points, like the distance between the eyes, the width of the nose, the shape of the cheekbone, the depth of the eye sockets, and so on. For example, Apple's Face ID system projects 30,000 infrared dots on a user's face, and then deploys an infrared camera to fingerprint the unique features to securely unlock a device. CCTV cameras, AI-enabled facial recognition systems, and remote sensing technologies are but the tip of the iceberg in technologies of remote control. There are automatic license plate readers, cell phone tower simulators, and mobile data extraction systems. Installed at choke points throughout the internet and telecommunication networks are deep packet inspection and content filtering devices. Thousands of apps routinely installed on mobile devices harvest masses of data points as we go about our daily lives, uploading them to platforms for archiving and analysis, and then selling the data to third parties, many of whom now see government security services as a highly lucrative crossover market. Among the many political effects of the last couple of decades' worth of innovations in digital technologies, the sudden rise of technologically enabled superpower policing may be among the least appreciated but most consequential.
Daniel Dudney again. We're on this topic of the totalitarian potential of this technology. And remember that the initial vision of this technology was libertarian, that it was going to empower individuals, that it was going to make hierarchical organizations obsolete. And unfortunately, this has been an immense empowerment of state capacity. You know, you go back and you think about the totalitarian vision in Orwell and others, it always presumed a level of surveillance that at the time was actually futuristic. We're basically moving into a situation where the human species is now significantly enmeshed and embedded in a planetary information simulacrum, an information object of immense complexity and capacity, in which all information about everything, everywhere, all the time can be accumulated. And the question of who is going to have access to that kind of information and what kind of purposes they can put it towards is a fundamental question. And we have to be very sober about this. This is a technology that may be much better for empowering the adversaries of liberal democracy than for empowering liberal democracy. At a minimum, it's going to be necessary for liberal democracy to step up and come up with a regime for the use of this technology in ways that are compatible with its fundamental principles. And if we can't do that, we have to realistically expect liberal democracy to wither away, to dissolve away.
This is Meredith Whitaker. I think this is a really important observation. I think there's another element here as well, that oftentimes this data gets used to train algorithmic models, machine learning models that are then themselves deployed to make determinations and predictions. So that complicates further this notion of privacy, because even if I don't contribute my personal data to a data set that is used to train an algorithm, if that algorithm is used to make a decision about whether I will be hired, whether I get medical care, whether I go to school or not, that is impacting me in an extremely intimate and extremely consequential way. And that, I think, this speaks for the need for more robust understandings of collective privacy and collective harm, and also the need to begin to expand the scope of our regulatory apparatus to deal with the reuse and repackaging of these data as they thread through so many different systems, so many different institutions, and so many different uses.
Part 4. Data Fusion. As with surveillance capitalism in more consumer-oriented spheres, it's natural and irresistible for companies that service law enforcement and security agencies to try to integrate various data sources into a single system, known as fusion in industry jargon. The concept of fusion speaks volumes about the broader implications of our communications ecosystem. Whereas checks and balances aim to divide government agencies against each other to guard against abuses of power, fusion aims to bring them together. Examples of data fusion around policing and intelligence are legion and have been growing ever since 9/11. Probably the most notorious of the data fusion services used widely by the government is sold by Palantir, a company that has its origins in PayPal's fraud detection unit. Palantir's data fusion and analytics platforms are widely employed by U.S. security agencies both at home and abroad. The same fusion system that helped pinpoint targeted assassinations as part of counter-terror operations in Afghanistan and Iraq is now deployed in domestic U.S. policing efforts such as those undertaken by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The trends toward data fusion have helped blur military and civilian applications. Technologies developed for commercial purposes are easily cross-purposed for public security, intelligence, and military functions. For their part, security agencies of all sizes have voracious appetites for data acquisition, fusion, and analytics services. Many at the higher end, such as departments of defense and signals intelligence agencies, have deep pockets for contracting. Dual-use applications work in both directions, with companies that start out in civilian or consumer-based marketplaces, then expanding to service policing, intelligence, and military needs. Consider Amazon, which began as a mere website selling books and DVDs, and is now one of the largest tech companies in the world, specializing in cloud computing, streaming media, e-commerce, and artificial intelligence, among other services. Not surprisingly, Amazon has made inroads into the law enforcement and security marketplace in recent years. In June 2019, investigative reporters noted that Amazon had pitched its facial recognition technology to Immigration and Customs Enforcement at around the same time the company announced it had developed a new algorithm to better detect fear and improve age range detection. coming at a time when Immigration and Customs Enforcement was rounding up undocumented immigrants and refugees and separating children from their parents, the prospective sale of such a technology to the agency was sinister, to say the least. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. I can't say how many variations of this phrase I've read or heard. It most often comes up as a question after one of my talks. But while intuitively appealing and simple, the phrase is misleading and inaccurate. Contrary to the saying, many people do indeed have something to hide, and for good reason. Moreover, even if they are not doing anything wrong, they can still have something to fear. For those living in autocratic states, for example, the simple exercise of the most basic human rights enjoyed elsewhere can cost them prison time or worse. Recall that Ahmad Mansour, a victim of multiple targeted espionage attacks by his own government, was ultimately thrown in an Emirati prison for insults to the regime. What the, quote, nothing to hide argument overlooks, in short, is the potential for the abuse of power. Corruption, authoritarianism, and despotism are not practices neatly compartmentalized into sovereign boundaries with some good states over here and the bad ones over there. They are pervasive throughout all societies and cut across all territorial boundaries. We forget that these practices are endemic to human societies and can easily reappear even among countries that have safeguards in place to defend against them. It's worth reminding ourselves how numerous and recent are abuse of power episodes within ostensibly liberal democratic societies. It was only several decades ago that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI illegally wiretapped American citizens, including civil rights advocates, members of Congress, and Supreme Court justices, without any concern for properly authorized judicial warrants. It was barely more than a generation ago that the CIA undertook secret LSD experiments on prisoners and mental health patients. It was barely 50 years ago that Canada's RCMP broke into hundreds of residences without a warrant and went so far as to burn a barn to prevent what they suspected was going to be a meeting between Quebec separatists and the Black Panthers. It was only within the last 10 years that the NSA secretly subverted encryption standards meant to protect the public's communications, hacked into the data networks connecting major cloud computing platforms, and installed massive data trawling equipment on the backbones of the U.S. telecommunications systems. A list of abuses like these could fill an entire library. It's also worth reminding ourselves that recent years have brought about a disturbing descent into authoritarianism, fueled by and in turn driving income inequality in grotesque proportions, and propelling the rise of a kind of transnational gangster economy. There is today a large and influential class of kleptocrats spread across the globe and supported by a professional service industry of lawyers, shell companies, accountants, and PR firms, the members of which move seamlessly between the private sector and agencies of the state. These are people who don't care whether or not someone has nothing to hide or is doing anything wrong. They thrive by victimizing innocent others, undermining individuals and organizations that seek to hold them to account, and using the power and machinery of the state for personal gain. There is no jurisdiction that is immune to corruption and authoritarian practices, only greater or lesser degrees of protection against them. While it's become common to acknowledge the way these technologies are enabling a new type of digital authoritarianism to flourish, it would be a mistake to conclude that the effects of social media are limited to a group of bad actors over there. In fact, the most disturbing dynamics are playing themselves out within nominally liberal democratic countries. Hyper-militarized policing practices that draw on big data and AI-enabled surveillance tools are creating states on steroids. Just look around next time you pass through any airport border crossing. Meanwhile, the constraints on abuse of power seem quaint and old-fashioned, as if constructed for a different time and context. We now have 21st century policing practices with 19th and 20th century checks and balances. In its 2019 annual report, the U.S. NGO Freedom House, which measures indicators of democracy worldwide, recorded, quote, the 13 consecutive year of decline in global freedom. Its report, entitled Democracy in Retreat, noted that, quote, the reversal has spanned a variety of countries in every region, from long-standing democracies like the United States to consolidated authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. The report noted that authoritarian regimes have become more nakedly authoritarian, absent outside pressures to reform, while countries that had recently transitioned to democratic rule had stagnated and slid backwards. But most remarkable was its observation that, quote, even long-standing democracies have been shaken by populist political forces that reject basic principles like the separation of powers. It would be an error to claim social media are the sole cause of this disturbing descent. But it seems increasingly indisputable that the environment of social media is dramatically facilitating it. Absent specific constraints or measures to the contrary, digital authoritarianism is taking root in China, with its exports acting as a transmission belt to spread those practices abroad. That may not be a surprise to many, but it is also taking root elsewhere, leapfrogging over constraints and countermeasures, and putting liberal democratic institutions to the test. Thanks to superpower policing, we all now suddenly find ourselves looking over a precipice into a dark abyss of unconstrained abuses of power.
You've been listening to A Great Leap Forward for the Abuse of Power, the fourth of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures by Ron Deibert. The entire lecture series will be on our website, cbc.ca/Masseys, and you can also download the podcasts from our podcast page. Your local or online bookseller will have the book of the lectures, Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, published by House of Anansi Press. And now that you've been listening to the lectures, we're inviting you to send us the questions you have for Ron Deibert. We'll be creating a special program to run with the rebroadcast of the series in March 2021. I'll be talking with Ron along with the guests you heard on the program, and we'll be discussing some of the questions you send us. So send your questions to masseyquestions@cbc.ca. That's masseyquestions@cbc.ca. Our partners in the Massey Lectures series are Massey College in the University of Toronto and House of Anansi Press. The Massey Lectures series is produced by Philip Coulter. Online production by Althea Madison, Andrew Nguyen, and Sinisha Jolich. Our web producer is Lisa Ayuso. Technical production, Danielle Duval. Senior producer, Nicola Luksic. The executive producer of the Massey Lectures and Ideas is Greg Kelly, and I'm Nala Ayed.